limited series from Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for those of us working in, alongside, and adjacent to higher education and student affairs. I'm your host, Heather Shea, and we were recording this episode at 5:11 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, March 27th. As always, things might have changed by the time you listen. This week, in our fourth episode, we are continuing our deep dive into the evolving landscape of higher ed. Current campus context is all about making sense of the moment we're in. Each episode, we bring in two experts to break down the latest developments, what's happening, why it matters, and how we can respond within our own spheres of influence. Our goal is to move beyond the headlines, providing context, perspective, and actionable strategies to help you navigate these shifts. As part of this series, we have a rotating panel of 5 experts. So you will hear some familiar voices over the next several weeks, and you can learn more about all of our correspondents at studentaffairsnow.com. Now, before we get into today's conversation, I'm excited to introduce our expert correspondents today who will help us unpack the latest developments. First, back again this week, Dr. Felecia Commodore is an expert in leadership, governance, and administrative practices in higher education with a focus on HBCUs, MSIs, and Black women in leadership. She is an associate professor in education policy, organization, and leadership at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Welcome back, Felecia.
Thank you, Heather. Glad to be back.
And I am excited to introduce our 5th correspondent, Dr. Demetri L. Morgan. Dr. Morgan is an expert in institutional governance, campus climate, student activism, and STEM education in higher ed. He is an associate professor of education at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Demetri.
Great to finally be on, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
So am I. So let's go to the news and see what we're unpacking. Over the past several weeks, we have tracked several different stories. We're going to pick up on some of those themes today. We've tracked the dismantling of the Department of Education, the weaponization of federal funding as key strategies being used by the Trump administration to reshape higher ed. This week, I have 3 major developments that kind of build on these themes. First, the student loan system is facing a radical overhaul. Trump is proposing to shift federal student loans to the Small Business Administration. This is alarming for me, not just because I think the SBA lacks the infrastructure to manage student aid, but for me, it also signals a shift away from education as a public good, treating students like entrepreneurs rather than learners. This raises, for me, serious concerns about access, accountability, and borrower protections. What would this mean for repayment terms? What about, the income-driven options for changing your student loan status, and even legal challenges? And I guess I'm just curious about the congressional approval that might be required for this kind of move. At the end, I think the question remains who will be hit hardest. And I know first gen and low income students, I think, stand to lose the most. So that's story number 1. Story 2, the fight over diversity, equity, and inclusion continues to escalate while the crackdown on campus free speech and academic freedom intensifies. I don't know. We were talking about this before we started recording. There's just hypocrisy in this. This is staggering. Conservatives who once claimed to defend open debate are now pushing laws that restrict what faculty and students can say about race, gender, and inclusion. Universities are being forced into impossible choices, balancing political pressure, financial survival, and their core values. And some institutions seem to be retreating, and others may be positioning themselves for a longer fight. After reading about Columbia's response last Friday, I have to ask, are we witnessing caution, pragmatism, or concession? This isn't just about policy. It's an effort to reshape higher ed's core values. And then finally, with universities under political and financial threat, our professional associations are emerging as higher ed's last line of defense. Organizations representing faculty, AAUP, and administrators, ACE, ACE, and APLU, as well as diversity officers, NADAHE, are leading lawsuits and advocacy efforts against these attacks. If individual institutions hesitate out of financial fear, will these associations be enough to hold the line? So this week's developments reinforce this broader shift. Higher education is being forced into a defensive position on student aid, academic freedom, and institutional autonomy. So the question is, who is willing to fight back? Let's get into it. So Demetri, given what I've just shared, where should we begin? Would you like to talk about? What should we unpack further?
I think starting with the money, the loans and the SBA is always a good because I think that also is a bridge between kind of people's own personal realities as educators in higher ed who many of whom have also gone on to grad school and might have taken out loans both in undergrad and grad school. And then it also impacts the future of institutions. So I think that's a good place to start.
All right. What about you, Felecia? Where would you like to kind of start in unpacking these stories today?
I think that's a good place to start also is looking at the moving around of duties as there is an attempt to dismantle the Department of Ed. We're kind of, because I think the way in which that has been handled points to some of the other things that we're seeing, and how the institutions are responding to certain things, how associations or different advocacy groups feel they have to respond to certain things. I really feel you started to see the uptick in action one way or another when that EO came out that essentially started to dismantle, not get rid of, but dismantle. And that's two different things, the Department of Education. And I think that's what we saw, a very significant uptick in action based on that.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, the appropriations for federal student aid are administered by Congress, right? Or not being administered. They're appropriated by Congress, but then they are administered by the Department of Education. Can somebody just like take that giant checkbook and give it to another? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Short answer is no. From the Constitution, Congress has the power of the purse. So anything that is treasury, financial related for the federal government has to both be initiated and when changed, signed off by Congress. And so what we're seeing with the shift in how the loans are being administered is part of, a broader strategy from the federal administration to push on the boundaries of accepted norms and law and see, essentially what can we get away with, or what can we do before other, checks and balances are able to weigh in. And so I think that's part of the calculation that if we can move it to the SBA and get it to run well, however that is defined, then Congress can follow suit and just be like, oh yeah, that's a great place to put it instead of it operating the proper way, which is if Congress wanted to move it, that is something that they would need to add into the legislation. But that's much more risky with the slimmer margins in the House and, really trying to think about the political theater that's going to be needed. Because I think even if you believe that student loans moving forward should be radically different, you still have millions of borrowers who have a relationship with the Department of Education who are going to be impacted by how this is done. And those constituents don't just, live in certain places. They live everywhere. And so that's much harder of a calculation that I think the administration is trying to get ahead of and say, like, look, we can make it work here instead of doing it the harder way through Congress.
Yeah, and I would like to add on to that. So a short yes and then a yes and I think that my colleague here is being very gracious to the federal administration, in that assuming there was a strategy here. From my perspective, there was an attempt to dismantle all the functions of the Department of Ed without actually understanding what the Department of Ed does. And so when those pronouncements were made, there was pushback. And the pushback was on what about loans? What about Pell Grants? What about? And so then we saw a very intentional response like, oh no, we're not messing with those things, right? And then it was like, we got to figure out what to do with those things because those are the things that people are pushing back on. And so it was like, oh, we're going to move them here because if we look back prior to the election, the conversation was moving all the student loan stuff to the Treasury.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was what was said then, right?
Yeah.
Now we're moving it to SBA. And to me, there was never an intention for SBA to take those things on because you cut the SBA in half.
Right.
By workforce. So you never intended for these folks to do this. So, right. So to me, there's also a lot of, to the point of pushing boundaries of not just checks and balances, but also figuring out how much we can do before we get pushback, and then figuring out what we get pushback on and let that pushback direct us onto what is the next strategy that we're going to do so people will like let us do what we want to do. And so I actually think there wasn't a strategy at all around what to do with these things. And so it was like, oh, that makes sense, the SBA, but you still don't have enough workforce, and pointing to not really knowing what happens through the administration of these things is that there are very intentional, specific things and processes that you have to do to administer student loans and Pell Grants and these things that SBA workforce are not trained on. Yeah. So they're not even equipped, many of them, to process all of this stuff. So it's just going to cause a really problematic backlog, I think.
Yeah. And I was thinking about it. I kind of mentioned this in my recap about just treating students like businesses, right? So then does it become we're not going to give you a loan if you're going to pursue a degree in the humanities, right? And then because you're not going to be a good investment if you can't get a job or whatever the perspective is, right? Like I could see a whole slew of other repercussions.
I think it's a really important point just to double click on, as some of my students say, in that, I've been trying to take seriously and maybe too much so, a fair point. But the new Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, has said very clearly in multiple public remarks that the Treasury's goal, at least, is to help reprivatize the economy, that it had gotten too public oriented. And so I think your point, Heather, is like absolutely part of maybe not the strategy, maybe that's too generous, but this idea of how do we reprivatize things that some feel have become too public oriented, and is shifting it to small business. Does that help us, make this argument that now we should be able to weigh in on what you major in because you're not a good investment, and this is a private, sort of investable vehicle. And also prior to this, a big conversation was on income share agreements, and basically a sort of conservative solution had been, saying, hey, let a private investor who has a portfolio in gold, the stock markets, bonds, also invest in, X amount of students, and, take a percentage of their future earnings, because it, frees up the federal government having support. And now I'm like, that, those sorts of ideas are definitely in play, likely because it helps privatize the sort of educational industry. But I think the downstream impact of like, will I have choice in what I choose to major in, or what type of institution I want to go to, becomes the central question that won't be answered in any of these movements.
Yeah.
And we already know, I know I've become like the history buff all of a sudden, which is not my field of study, but we saw before what happened when we put too much of the loan system in private service providers' hands. I mean, we had predatory lending. We had predatory promissory notes to the point where people had to get sued, right? Institutions had to give money to students because of some of the unethical things they're doing. So I definitely think there are lots of alarm bells to go off. But I do agree, Demetri, and with you, Heather, like this is you can see the direct path to the privatization of the loan process.
Yeah. And I think this is, this is really related as well to concepts of academic freedom. So one of the things that Columbia agreed to in their, like the list of demands that they were given, I don't remember what it was exactly called, right? But one of them was about putting an academic department into receivership. Like, what is that? I mean, to me, that seems like a pretty direct infringement. And what else could Columbia have done? That's the other part. I feel like there's like an impossible choice here, but like talk about government infiltration into what is being taught. We're now going to put this program. Anyway, love to hear what your thoughts are on that part too.
I'll jump in. The academic receivership was, I mean, that one made my eyes open really wide. One, because whenever you have a term come up that we haven't used in decades or we don't use regularly, it scares me. Like, whoa, what, like, and I had mad people texting me like, what in the world is an academic receivership? I do think it's concerning to think that a department gets put in the hands, and it was very vague, right? It didn't say who the department's hands are being in, but I think we can all see, even if it's not, it being a short line or open door to government control, being able to control departments, which is very problematic. But I think there's a conversation that's not being had in this area is really who's making that decision? Was it just a list of demands that the institutional leadership decided to go with? Was this a conversation from the board? I feel like we're not having enough conversation about if some of these things were already in play or discussions that were happening at the board level, right? Having problems with programs or being concerned about oversight and things of this nature that in traditional or quote normal, whatever that is, times wouldn't really go further than a discussion in the boardroom. But this demand from the administration, federal administration, opened the door for conversations that were already happening in private spaces to get some girth under there, some power. And so I really want us to wrestle with if all of this is just meeting the demands of the federal administration, or if the moment is creating an opportunity for conversations that were already happening.
Well, right before this episode went to record, Dr. Morgan, I knew it was gonna have to come up, but I think you all are experts in governance, and I'd love to hear any insights. But right before we went on the air, the president of the University of Michigan sent out a notice to the campus. So I'll let you take it from there.
So I guess it's a really important connection and point that Dr. Commodore was bringing up in how a lot of these organizational sagas is the fancy term we use it, but these narratives, these happenings that are happening on campus have, just like any good story, have or bad story or or horror story, there's a beginning, a climax, and a sort of resolution. And we're seeing a lot of the sort of climatic making of decisions, but there's been buildups. And I think that the University of Michigan is sort of a case study to that. I'm newly at University of Michigan. I got there, and I sort of think all the time. I try to explain it's like the sort of meme of the person like walking into the room on fire with the pizza. Like that's how I feel coming into the University of Michigan. It's like I'm happy to be here, and it's like everything is burning down. But there was a board meeting in December where there was rumors that they were dismantling the diversity, equity, inclusion apparatus throughout the University of Michigan, and faculty, staff, and students rallied. Community members as well rallied, and and almost now, like I'm gonna go find it, but almost cringe-worthy wise, the regents at that meeting sort of like we're like, oh, where's all this innuendo coming from? Like we're not, touching diversity, and in fact, they announced the establishment of a expanded Go Blue guarantee. And they were like, we're not touching this. But there was still all this rumors and chatter that things were happening. And so now then to get this email today where the president fleshed out a little bit of some of the ongoings of this kind of systematic review and all, none of that came up at this meeting, but there were things happening in the background. And then, in the email, the president, kind of listed out a lot of the federal dynamics, the Dear Colleague letter, things that have been covered on this podcast as, some of the things that they were being responsive to. But it's like, and also you've been, analyzing this investment for, in your own admission for a really long time. And this has sort of just heightened it. And I think it's a really tragic case of, us, pointing to some of these things, but also not acknowledging that the board has, some of the board members were publicly out on cable news talking about this. They were giving comment to the New York Times piece that came out in the fall. So there were lots of things when you look back in retrospective where like, oh yeah, this was just kind of like a systematic dismantling. And so a lot of people will see the news today and just point to this kind of like, spur of the moment decision, but actually it's been, and it's everything that Felecia said. And that is also likely happening in different ways at institutions where, listeners are at, and it's trying to pick up on those tea leaves, pick up on the chatter and believing it, but also trying to verify it, but also recognizing that people, especially in this type of climate, aren't trying to make up things in bad faith, but they're hearing things, they're seeing things. And there's a lot of credence to, especially when it comes to kind of unraveling the diversity, equity, and inclusion infrastructure.
Yeah, Dr. Commodore, before you joined us, actually, Demetri, we were saying that just happened. Like, what's happening on my campus, right? And you were saying your campus has a new website, right? So
Yeah.
for our listeners,
So
that might be useful.
yeah, so we have gotten we get pretty regular communication from our chancellor and our provost. And our campus has created a website specifically for federal updates. So you can go to that website at any time and see what's the new update, what the campus is doing, ask questions. And so I do think it's been really helpful. I mean, it hasn't stopped all of the, whiplash, but I think it has taken some of the angst out of waiting to see what the system's going to say or waiting what the chancellor is going to say. And you can just say, when I see the Michigan news go out, well, what is Illinois doing? I can just go to our website and look. But so I think that's been helpful because it's so constant. And I think for those of us who are working at institutions, students at institutions, or connected to institutions in one way or another, it's hard sometimes it's so much information. And so being able to funnel that messaging and that information in a way that is consumable, sorry for the noisy background, can help bring a little less angst to what you're doing, which I think is necessary for us to sustain what we're going through.
Yeah.
One quick question I would love for both of you, not trying to take your job, Heather, you're doing great, but I just would love for both of your thoughts on this because you both are experts in the space, and it's something I've been turning around since the Columbia letter on Friday. Is how in a lot of not just the diversity, equity, and inclusion scholarship that we've seen, but this critiques, whether it be Women's Center, of like institutions are performative, right? Like in the DEI space, like that there was a sort of critique from, quote unquote, inside the house. How performative do you think some of these moves by Columbia or Michigan are, right? Like, so there's absolutely real impacts. You know, people's jobs are on the line. You know, they were clear. The office is being shut down. The DEI plan is discontinued. You know, Columbia had a whole list of things that they were doing. But what is like the theater and the performative, or is there, or is this different? Like, and that's been something I've been turning around of like, yeah, institutions 4 years ago, 5 years ago made tons of pronouncements and only a smattering of them came true. And so is this the same or is this different? And is the political climate that different that they can't be performative anymore? They actually have to follow through. They actually have to, you know, do the things. I don't know. I'm curious like what you all see as people who saw that trajectory, knew the pronouncements, saw the demands students made, you know, just 4 or 5 years ago. And, you know, lots of them were called out for being performative. Is there that similar dynamic?
Felicia, I'll let you.
You gonna let me take this one
Yeah.
first? So Demetri knows this. I truly believe in theater being an integral part of how organizations work, particularly higher education organizations or any organization that has a political aspect. So I do think there is some theater involved, but I'm going to stick with a theater kind of metaphor here, so everybody try and roll with me. Hopefully it follows. Even though theater is often performative, there can be performances that have lasting impact, that can shift culture, that can invite us and inspire us to live up to our values and actually latch on to things. That's a good performance, a useful performance does that, right? So I think it's less about are these institutions being performative, but it's performative to what end, right? The second part of that metaphor, I would say, and I know I'm about to be in my history bag again, there is a phenomenon in theater, particularly us Broadway. I'm a theater kid. We call revivals, right? So really good performances or really good musicals or plays often come back in 10 years, in 15 years, and we do a revival version of it, right? Where we still keep the core of it and we tweak a few things so that it speaks even more to the time or even brings out more of the artistry or the interpretation of that piece while maintaining its integrity that is at the core of it. I think higher ed does that often.
Yeah.
I think we have revival moments in higher ed, and like what we're seeing now is yet to be determined. But I think we will either find out that this is performative to no end, or there's performative to an end to have a purpose and to bring about a revival of performances that had impact on us in the past, right? And we've seen movements happen that at the surface just look like student protests or a sit-in somewhere or a policy that was randomly made or department that was just created. But those things had long-lasting impacts that changed higher ed as we know it, that changed society as we know it, right? And so I think the question, or what I would say is that it's yet to be seen, but I think even good performances can lead to impact, and higher ed is due for a revival of some of its greatest performances.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And I think part of it is the audience, right? Like what are students asking for and what do students benefit and how are we hearing from them? I mean, this is about the stories, right? And the ways in which their engagement in the campus space has that lasting impact as well, right? So there's an interesting study there when you think about, how you've lived through these different social movements and how student activism has shifted. And Demetri knows this a little bit because of the list of demands that Michigan State has worked through over the past several years. And I think performativity is really it might feel performative for some who've maybe seen it a couple times, but for some students, like this is the first time they've ever had this, engagement with the thing, whatever it is, right? Like I could continue your theater metaphor because I studied, my dissertation was an analysis of a theater performance as a part of a student activism. But I keep going back to, like, for some of the students, that piece was so incredibly moving. And so that, I guess, kind of shifting into the what can we do from a student affairs perspective, I'm really curious about, like, how do we help keep student hope alive during this moment, keeping them engaged? I mean, we were just noticing around my office, it feels like student engagement is down. And then what are the things that we can help kind of as like the secret decoder ring, help them make sense of this moment that we're in? Either grad students, undergrad, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of like how do we take this and work with our students around the moment?
That's great. One, thank you both. As not a theater person, I was able to follow, so good job to you. Yeah, it's a great question, Shay. One of the things I think is really important in times of, sort of transition or grief is being in community and just holding space with not with an agenda, not with like this, we're going to train you on this, just like what is in the atmosphere? What do we need to talk about? What are on people's minds? Because just, sort of showing up and being allowed to emote, being allowed to listen, but sort of being in proximity, even like this, like even, is really important. And I think people, are looking for spaces and outlets to just show up and to think and talk. And so in the ways that, particularly student affairs professionals are good at just holding space and being present and affirming people, like that just has to be an ongoing tool that we open up, even, sort of, it doesn't even have to be extra spaces. There's gonna be like, hey, we were, doing this program anyways, let's come 15 minutes early and check in. Or let's stay for 15 minutes after and just check in. I want to, before we go do X, I want to just, see how everybody's doing. So that's one tangible one. And then the other thing I've been thinking a lot about is, where are the spaces to like ask that kind of like I just tried to model, like I've been turning that over in my head since Friday, and both of yours perspectives, like it was like I was like, oh, it felt like an itch that just got scratched. Like, and so where are the spaces where we can sort of ask the not fully formed question that we see something and we just need to ask someone, and you all thankfully have really great answers, but it just felt good to ask it and then also be, receive a really good answer. And so I also think about like the question, to your point, Dr. Shea, like the question forming, especially if this is your first time like experiencing, like that is also a process. Like I might not have like a really, quote unquote articulate question. I just know I'm feeling things. I know I want to be able to like put things together, and how do I, even get some space to like form the question, and normalizing that, being like, yeah, like I just had a question and tried to frame it the best I could, and you all picked it up. And so I think that too, of like acknowledging that, being able to ask or say or articulate what it is going on is a process in and of itself, and we have to open up spaces for that laboratory of trying out that language or making those connections, and that it doesn't always happen neatly in just like one like processing space.
What about you,
Yeah,
Dr. Commodore?
I mean, a lot of like retweet, well, maybe not retweet, reblueski, skeets, I don't know what they're called.
Like,
Yes, like, there we go. What Demetri said, I think also like, I remember, I think particularly with grad students, but I think this could translate to undergraduate students as well. But I think if we, one, look at students as holistic, right? Like they're not just students, like they hold multiple identities and realities. And I think just giving students space, or empowerment to know that their feelings and their processing is data. Like
Valid.
it is knowledge. There is knowledge within what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. And what I hope to do as a faculty member is give them a place to make sense of that knowledge and use that knowledge in conjunction with what we know from research and other kind of more traditional ways of knowledge, to not just make sense of the world that they're experiencing, but to ignite them to be imaginative of the world they can make. Right. And I think, there was a season in higher ed, and you see me about to roll my eyes, where we were reimagining everything. We were reimagine this, reimagine that, we were all these, and then it went away, right? And I think part of that was reality set in and our imaginations went away, right? And what I hope to do is say, this is reality, right? In very ways that I've been at a conference today where we're talking about this, ways that senior scholars did for me and my faculty members to me, this is reality. And I want you to be truthful about what reality is. But your reality doesn't have to be permanent, right? You have the ability, the opportunity, the resources to build a world that is the reality you want it to be. But take this information that you're processing, what you're experiencing now, as knowledge, and the opportunity of the knowledge you're getting to decide whether you want this to be reality or you want to build a new reality. And what I hope we as faculty, as student affairs professionals, as administrators and leaders, that we are creating spaces and support systems and support structures to facilitate world building. And so that when we look back, we can say, wow, we created paths for them to take all of that experience and make this whole thing better, and for it to continue to exist in ways we never saw.
Yeah, that I love that. It's a super hopeful vision of the future. And I have also long
Which isn't
said,
normal for me, by the way. Demetri, I'm a cynic by nature. So everyone should hang on to this. This is about how much hope you're ever going to get from me. No.
The moment to tag, right? Yeah, I have long said to students, who always like, well, I didn't want to ask a question because I didn't know how to say it, or I didn't want it to come out like, I was gonna say it. And I'm like, your self-censoring is keeping your ideas from entering this world. And I'd rather you, provide an imperfect, comment or belief than you just sit back. Because often when we sit back, somebody else says it, right? And then we're like, oh, I was thinking that same thing, right? So like, let's just put and that world building idea, I think, is really valuable. So we're at final thoughts. We're definitely not getting this episode in under a half an hour today. It's all right. Good. But I am really curious about what you all see on the horizon. What's keeping you up at night and what's bringing you joy? And you can answer all three. You can focus on one. Whichever of you would like to go first.
So, one of the things that I have been thinking about, I've been tracking bills coming that have been filed in Congress, because at some point you can do all of the optics of executive order, but at some point Congress has to do its job. And to Dr. Commodore's point earlier, I was literally, and I can give the bill and post it in show notes. There's been a bill introduced for the dismantling, but even in that bill that was introduced in February, it said that the loans were supposed to go to the Treasury, like Project 2025 said. So they're not even if this bill was voted on and passed, they're already out of compliance. So. But I do think that it's coming to a head. All that to say, it's coming to a head, that Congress and the courts are gonna, eventually start to weigh in, and so, quite frankly, it's gonna get worse before it gets better, in whatever better is, because the silence and absence of the other two checks in this system is we're just in the thick of that, and so, but on the horizon is that those two entities have to start, sort of playing ball, negotiating, ruling, and it will create a different set of predicaments to respond to, but it won't be, just the executive sort of laying claim to all the air. So that's on the horizon. I'm trying to understand what Congress is doing, trying to brush up on the Supreme Court and understanding how they're, dealing with emergency injunctions and different things because the other checks are coming, but it's just not as quickly as we want. Um, the thing that is, kind of bringing me joy, like I should have grabbed it, but my 7-year-old, I've been talking about this all day, and it's spring break, and so my 7-year-old was in the office, and she wrote a poem, and one line that was in it is that, we all deserve kindness, we all deserve, to receive kindness, and it just, both broke my heart that she had to listen to me like yell and talk about, all these things all day in the office, but that, it doesn't always have like these things that we're going through are like taught and trained and it's, what we convey. But we also can instill not only in, our young ones, but also in the students and our colleagues, like that kindness like still matters. And I know that that's quaint, but it just brought me joy that like, hopefully my little one is like seeing that even in the midst of this, I'm trying to center kindness, and for that to show up in the poem just brought me a lot of joy. Yeah, so I will pause there, but yeah, those are the two things that are kind of on my radar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think similarly what's keeping me up at night is really the legislative process. I think I've been trying to keep track with what's going on in Congress so much. But also I've become very, very concerned about state legislatures, where particularly for higher ed, I will continue to say this, like that is where we will be hit the most. And I just don't think we're talking about it enough.
Yep.
We're talking a lot about the Department of Ed, and I'm not trying to trivialize the loan stuff and all that, but state appropriations, state policies, all of these things that could get codified at the state level, we must pay attention to that. And I just feel like it's getting lost in conversation. We're seeing states flatten. We've already been seeing states defund higher ed for years. Now they're flattening funding. They're getting inspiration from what's happening at the federal level to codify some of this dismantling of DEI, trying to control curriculum into state legislation and connecting it to state appropriations. And I have really been concerned that we're going to look up and state sessions have ended and all kinds of stuff is going to get codified, and we weren't prepared because we weren't paying attention to it. So that's what's keeping me up at night. But I'll say what is giving me joy is that I've seen the kind of a reinvigoration of higher ed scholarship and us really thinking about who we want to be, what our values are. For better or for worse, we're at least thinking about it in ways that I don't know that are not just performative. I think we really are making some decisions that history will tell us where we landed. And that's kind of given me hope because I think we've become kind of complacent as a field or comfortable. So this has lit a spark in us. So I'm kind of, that brings me joy. And also that the days are getting longer and the sun is up longer. I just, this is my first year in the Midwest, and I am just happy to see the sun and not snow every morning.
Gray winter. It's been a long
So, and not to sound cheesy, but it is a reminder that although climate change is real, contrary to popular belief, seasons still exist. And that means that seasons come and seasons go. And so keeping that in mind, just figuring out how we persevere through this season.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody said the other day, gosh, 2025 has been a long year. I'm like, that is a good way to kind of think about it. And I agree. The sun is definitely on the horizon. Hopefully it's going to move its way up in the sky really soon. So, well, before we wrap, I just want to thank you both so much for your time and for your insights, your wisdom. I have found over the past 4 weeks these conversations to be really critical, and I'm really looking forward to continuing next week. We want you to catch up on past episodes. If you've missed any of the previous episodes, you can get them at studentaffairsnow.com/current-campus-context. And I just want to also send a special thanks to the entire Student Affairs Now team. We meet every Thursday, and today's conversation was really generative. So thank you to Keith and Glenn and Rochelle for continually shaping this series. Higher ed is shifting fast, and we are hearing from you that these discussions are mattering. Keep the conversation going. You can share this episode, post your takeaways, tag us on Instagram, Facebook, or Blue Sky, and we would love to hear from you at host@studentaffairsnow.com. And then finally, I'm going to give a little pitch. If you believe there is value to these conversations and you want to help sustain Current Campus Context, we are looking for a sponsor to support this work. So if you know of an organization that's interested in partnering, please reach out to us at host@studentaffairsnow.com. Thanks for tuning in to Current Campus Context, brought to you by Student Affairs Now. We'll see you next week.